The boy appeared at the edge of town just before dusk, no older than 10, with dirt on his face and terror in his eyes that no child should ever carry. He stumbled past the old rail depot, past the hitching posts outside the saloon, searching every face like he was looking for someone who might save him from something unspeakable. The sheriff watched from across the dust trail, his instinct sharpening the moment. He saw how the boy flinched at every sudden movement, how he kept his arms wrapped tight around his own ribs like he was holding himself together. This wasn't a child who had simply wandered off from a homestead or gotten separated from a wagon train. This was a boy running from something, and in these frontier towns, when a child runs, it's rarely towards safety they're headed, but away from a nightmare no one else wants to see. The sheriff had learned long ago that the worst monsters in the Old West didn't howl at the moon or hide in canyon shadows. They lived in plain sight, wore familiar faces, and the scars they left were the kind that never showed on the surface. Something about this boy's silence screamed louder than any cry for help ever could. If you believe some stories deserve to be told, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next changed everything this town thought it knew about protection and family. The boy collapsed near the water trough outside the general store, his small body giving out like a rope finally snapping under too much weight. The sheriff was there in seconds, kneeling down, his weather hand steady as he checked the child for injuries, his eyes scanning for wounds, breaks, signs of violence. The boy's clothes were torn, his feet were blistered and bleeding through worn-out boots that looked 2 sizes too small, and there were bruises, dark purple and yellow, painting a map of pain across his thin arms. But it was a look in the boy's eyes that struck deepest, an emptiness that shouldn't exist in someone so young, a resignation that came from knowing that crying for help had stopped working a long time ago. The sheriff had seen that look before, in the eyes of women fleeing brutal husbands, in the faces of ranch hands beaten down by cruel foremen, in the hollow stares of those who'd learned that the world could be a place where mercy was just a word people said but never meant. He lifted the boy gently, carried him toward the sheriff's office, and the few townspeople who noticed turned away, as they always did, preferring their comfortable ignorance to the uncomfortable truth that evil often wore a father's face. Inside the office, the boy sat rigid in a wooden chair, his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched so tight the sheriff could see the muscles working beneath the dirt-streaked skin. The sheriff brought water, bread, a blanket, moving slowly, speaking softly, knowing that trust was something you couldn't demand from someone whose trust had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. The boy drank like he hadn't seen water in days, ate like every bite might be his last. And still he said nothing, his silence a fortress built from fear and survival. The sheriff had dealt with scared children before, runaways from orphan trains, kids separated from dead parents during Indian raids, young ones lost on the prairie who'd watched their families die of fever or starvation. But this was different. This boy wasn't lost. He had run. And whatever he was running from had carved itself so deep into his bones that even safety felt like a trap. The sheriff watched him, noting the way the boy's eyes darted to the door every few seconds, the way his body tensed at every sound from the street, the way he kept one hand near his pocket, like he was ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Hours passed before the boy finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper, cracked and small. "My pa's coming for me." That was all he said, and the way he said it, with such flat certainty, made the sheriff's blood run cold. This wasn't the voice of a child hoping to be reunited with a loving father. This was the voice of a prisoner who knew his warden would never stop hunting. The sheriff leaned back, kept his voice calm, asked gentle questions that the boy answered in fragments, pieces of a story that came out like shards of broken glass, cutting even as they were spoken. The boy had lived on a remote homestead, miles from the nearest town, with a father who worked cattle and drank whiskey, and had rules that made no sense except in the twisted logic of a man who believed his children were property, not people. The mother had died 2 winters back. The boy said, his voice go even quieter, and after that, everything got worse. The rules got stricter, the punishments got harder, and the silence in that house became so heavy it felt like drowning. The boy had an older sister, he whispered, but she disappeared one night. and his father said she'd run off with a drifter. But the boy knew better, had seen the fear in her eyes the weeks before she vanished, had heard her crying through the thin walls of their cabin. But something in the boy's story didn't fit together. Pieces that contradicted, details that shifted when the sheriff asked twice. The boy said his father was a cattleman, but his hands were too soft for ranch work, his clothes too clean despite the supposed days of running. He said he walked for 3 days across open prairie, but his boots, though worn, weren't torn through, and his face, though dirty, wasn't sunburned the way it should be after that much exposure. The sheriff didn't press, didn't accuse, just listened and watched. His decades of reading men and their lies telling him that truth and deception were tangled here in ways he didn't yet understand. The boy's fear was real, that much was certain, genuine terror that couldn't be faked. But the story around that fear had holes, gaps, shadows where something else was hiding. The sheriff had learned that sometimes the biggest lies people told were the ones they told themselves, the stories they built to make sense of pain too big to face directly. And sometimes the people running from monsters were carrying pieces of those monsters inside them, passed down like poison heirlooms. In the frontier towns of the Old West, everyone knew their neighbor's business, or thought they did. But the truth was that miles of empty prairie between homesteads created islands of isolation where anything could happen and no one would ever know. The sheriff had seen it before. Families living in their own small kingdoms. Fathers who ruled like tyrants. Mothers who disappeared into silence. Children who grew up thinking cruelty was just another word for love. The law could barely reach out there, stretched too thin across too much territory, arriving always too late, if it arrived at all. And even when it did, the men who committed these crimes knew how to talk, how to smile, how to convince a judge or a marshal that they were good Christian men doing their best in a hard land, that their children were simply wild or ungrateful or prone to exaggeration. The system protected them, not because it was designed to, but because it was designed by men just like them, men who believed that what happened inside a man's home was his business alone, that a father's authority was absolute, sacred, beyond question. The sheriff sent word out quietly, asking around about homesteads in the region, about families matching the boy's vague descriptions, about any report of trouble or disappearances. The replies came back slowly over the next few days, carried by riders and telegraph, fragments of information that painted a picture nobody wanted to look at directly. There was a man, people said, who lived about 30 miles north near the canyon ridge, kept to himself, came into town maybe twice a year for supplies, always alone. Some remembered he'd had a wife once, a quiet woman who never smiled, and there'd been children, 2 or 3 maybe, but no one had seen him in years. The man's name came up in whispers, the kind of whispers that said people suspected but didn't want to know for sure, didn't want to be the ones to lift a rock and see what crawled beneath. One old rancher mentioned that he'd tried to hire the man's daughter a few years back to help his wife with housework, but the father had refused, gotten angry, said his children weren't for sale or loan, said in a way that made the rancher uncomfortable enough that he never asked again. Another trader recalled that the man always bought rope, lots of rope, more than any normal ranching operation would need. And when asked about it once, the man had just smiled and said he liked to keep things secure. The boy stayed in the sheriff's office, sleeping on a cot in the back room, eating the meals the sheriff brought, slowly regaining some physical strength even as the fear in his eyes never quite faded. The sheriff never left him alone, never let anyone else watch him, sensing that the boy's trust was fragile as spider silk and twice as easy to break. At night, the boy had nightmares, crying out in his sleep. Words the sheriff couldn't quite make out, but that sounded like pleading, like apologies, like the voice of someone who'd been trained to believe that everything bad that happened was somehow their fault. During the day, the boy barely spoke, but sometimes he would ask questions, strange questions about whether the sheriff had children, whether he'd ever hurt someone he loved, whether bad men could tell they were bad or they thought they were good. The sheriff answered honestly, carefully, understanding that these weren't idle curiosities but desperate attempts by a young mind to map the moral universe and figure out where in that universe his father belonged. On the 4th day, a man rode into town tall and lean, with eyes that scanned the street like he was hunting something specific. He wore decent clothes, spoke politely to the townspeople he asked, said he was looking for his son who'd run off after a discipline incident, said the boy was prone to lying, to making up stories, to exaggerating small punishments into grand abuses. He had the righteous anger of a father wronged, the exhausted patience of a man trying to do right by a difficult child. And most people believed him immediately because that's what people want to believe, that children lied and parents suffered, and the natural order of things meant trusting the adult over child. But the sheriff, watching from across the street, saw something else, saw the way the man's eyes went cold when he thought no one was looking, saw the way his hand gripped his belt like he was imagining using it, saw the practiced performance of a man who'd gotten very good at playing the victim. This was a father, and the sheriff knew, with the certainty that comes from years of facing down evil in all its forms, that everything was about to get much worse before it got better. The father entered the sheriff's office with the confidence of a man who believed the law would side with him, as it always had, as it was designed to. He stood tall, removed his hat respectfully, and spoke in measured tones about a troubled boy, about a wife's death that had affected the family deeply, about trying his best in difficult circumstances. He showed papers, documents proving paternity, a marriage certificate, a deed to a homestead, all the official stamps and signatures that said this man was legitimate, respectable, entitled to his son. The sheriff listened without expression, let the man talk himself out, watched the performance with the detached attention of someone who'd seen this play performed too many times. Then the sheriff asked about the daughter, and the father's face flickered just for a moment, a crack in the mask. She'd run off with a man, he said, repeating the story, broke his heart, but he couldn't stop her. She was of age, made her choice. The sheriff asked what age exactly, and the father hesitated, said 17, then changed it to 18, then added that she'd always been headstrong, defiant, just like her brother. The sheriff rose slowly, walked to the window, looked out the street where Dust Devil spun and died. He'd sent a rider north 3 days ago, a trusted deputy with instructions to find the homestead, look around, report back quickly. That rider had returned just an hour before the father arrived, and what he'd found had turned the sheriff's suspicions into cold certainty. The homestead was there, isolated and dark, exactly as described, but there was more. Behind the main cabin, half hidden by tall grass, was a second structure, something between a shed and a cellar, with a heavy door and a lock on the outside. The deputy had broken in, and inside he'd found chains bolted to the wall, a dirt floor stained with things he didn't want to identify, and scratched into wood. Over and over were words, desperate words carved by different hands. Help us, please God, Papa no. Messages from children who'd learned that screaming brought no rescue. The deputy had also found a shallow grave, recent, and though he hadn't dug deep, he'd seen enough to know. The sister hadn't run off with a drifter. She'd tried to run, probably protect her brother, and the father had made sure she never made it far enough to tell anyone what happened in that house of horrors. The sheriff turned back to the father, his face carved from stone, his voice quiet but absolute. You're not taking that boy anywhere. The father's expression shifted, confusion giving way to indignation, then to anger, the mask falling away entirely. He spoke of rights, of law, of government overreach in small-town sheriffs who thought they could play God. He threatened lawyers, judges, men of influence who would see that justice was done, and this sheriff was removed from his position. But the sheriff just stood there, unmoved, and finally the father's voice changed, became pleading, then desperate, and in that desperation the truth spilled out like poison from a lance wound. He spoke of disappointment, of children who wouldn't obey, of a world that had become too soft, too weak, that didn't understand that discipline was love and pain was teaching. He spoke of his daughter who defied him, tried to leave, threatened to tell, and how he'd had no choice at all, because if she'd talked, everything would have been ruined. He spoke of his son who was just like her, weak, rebellious, ungrateful, who needed to be broken properly, shaped correctly, before it was too late. The father didn't even realize he was confessing, so convinced was he of his own righteousness. So deep was his belief that his actions were justified, necessary, even noble in their way. He spoke of control, of ownership, of his God-given right as a father to mold his children however he saw fit. And if that required rope and chains and locked doors, then so be it, because the world outside was dangerous and he was protecting them, teaching them, making them strong. The sheriff listened to every word, let the man dig his own grave with his mouth. And when the father finally stopped, breathing hard, eyes wild, the sheriff spoke one sentence that shattered everything. Your daughter didn't run off, and we both know it. The father's face went white, then red, then something beyond color. A shade that came from realizing that the game was over, that all his careful lies had crumbled, that the law, for once, wasn't going to look away. He lunged forward, hand reaching for the gun at his hip, but the sheriff was faster, decades faster, and before the father's fingers touched metal, he was on the ground, the sheriff's boot on his wrist, the cold barrel of a pistol pressed against his temple. In that moment, the boy appeared in the doorway from the back room, having heard everything, his small frame shaking but his eyes clear, no longer empty, but filled with something new. The terrible relief of truth finally spoken aloud. He looked at his father, pinned and helpless, and for the first time in his young life, he saw the man not as an unstoppable force of nature, but as what he really was. A broken, pathetic creature who'd used power over the powerless to feel strong. The boy didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there as witness, and his presence was testimony more powerful than any words could be. The sheriff kept his gun steady, his voice calm, and told the father exactly what was going to happen next, how he'd be tried, how the truth about the daughter would come out, how the cellar and the chains and the unmarked grave would speak louder than any defense attorney ever could. The father started to cry then, not from remorse but from self-pity, from the realization that his kingdom had fallen, that he'd lost, that the world he'd built on fear and suffering was collapsing around him. The sheriff called for deputies, for the marshal, for everyone who needed to know. And within an hour, the father was in chains himself, the same kind he'd used on his children, a poetic justice that nobody commented on, but everyone noticed. The townspeople gathered outside, having heard the commotion, and the sheriff told them plainly what had been happening 30 miles north of their comfortable lives, what had been going on while they'd chosen not to see, not to ask, not to interfere. Some looked ashamed, others angry. A few tried to defend their ignorance. But most just stood silent, confronted with the uncomfortable truth that monsters don't announce themselves. They blend in, smile, shake hands, and count on everyone else's desire for comfort to keep their crimes hidden. The father was led away, still protesting, still claiming misunderstanding, still unable to comprehend that his version of fatherhood was actually just torture with a family name attached. And the boy watched him go, this child who'd survived what no child should ever face, who'd found the courage to run when running seemed impossible, who'd trusted one man in a badge to be different from a man who'd worn a father's title. The next day, a search party rode out to the homestead and found everything the deputy had reported, plus more, a full accounting of years of abuse, neglect, and violence that would make grown men sick to document. They found the sister's grave, brought her body back for proper burial, gave her the dignity in death she'd been denied in her final moments of life. They found journals, the father's journals, where he'd written about his methods, his philosophy, his belief that he was doing God's work by breaking the spirits of his children so they could be rebuilt in his image. Reading those pages, the sheriff understood something that chilled him. This man genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong, that he was a victim of a world too weak to understand that true love required absolute control. It was a delusion of every tyrant throughout history, dressed up in a language of family values and frontier independence. And it had almost succeeded, would have succeeded if one boy hadn't been brave enough to run and one sheriff hadn't been willing to look at the truth nobody else wanted to see. The trial was scheduled for the county seat. 2 weeks out, time enough for lawyers to prepare, for witnesses to be gathered, for the full weight of the legal system to slowly grind into motion. The father sat in a cell, still talking, still explaining, still convinced that eventually someone would understand and set him free. His confidence was unshakable, built on a lifetime of getting away with everything, of talking his way out of consequences, of using his status as a property-owning white man in the frontier to shield himself from justice. He believed in the system because the system had always protected men like him, had always chosen to believe fathers over children, men over women, property owners over the powerless. And the terrible truth was that he might have been right to believe, because even with all the evidence, even with the graves and the chains and the journals, there were people already starting to whisper that maybe the sheriff had overreacted. Maybe the father had been stern, but not criminal. Maybe children exaggerated, and maybe the dead sister really had run off and died some other way. The sheriff watched these whispers spread, saw the community trying to rewrite the story into something less disturbing, something that wouldn't require them to question their own complicity in not noticing, not caring, not acting. He saw men at the saloon nod along with theories that the father was just old-fashioned, that discipline used to be harsh and children survived it, that maybe this was more about a power-hungry lawman than actual crimes. He saw women at church avoid the topic entirely, change the subject when the boy's situation came up, prefer to discuss weather and recipes rather than confront the reality that one of their community members had been torturing his children for years. The sheriff felt the isolation of doing what was right in a world that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, felt the weight of standing alone against not just one evil man, but the entire structure of society that had enabled that man's evil. He thought about giving up, about letting the lawyers handle it, about stepping back and allowing the system to do whatever the system would do. But then he'd see the boy still staying in the office's back room, still having nightmares, still learning to trust that not every adult would hurt him, and the sheriff would remember why he'd taken this job in the first place. The boy was healing, slowly, the way deep wounds heal, with setbacks and pain and scars that would never fully disappear. He started talking more, sharing memories that emerged in fragments, pieces of a childhood that had been stolen from him by the one person who should have protected it. He spoke of his mother, kind but broken, beaten down by years of living with a man who saw love as ownership and marriage as conquest. He spoke of his sister, brave and fierce, who'd tried to shield him from the worst of their father's rage, who'd taken punishments meant for him, who'd whispered stories at night to help him forget the day's horrors. He spoke of plans they'd made to escape together, childish plans that had no real chance of success, but that had kept hope alive in that dark house. And he spoke of the night his sister had tried to run, how their father caught her, dragged her back, and how the boy had heard her screaming, then silence, then nothing ever again. He'd been told she'd left, told to never mention her again, told that if he ever tried to run, he'd end up the same way. And he believed it until the pain became greater than the fear, and running became the only option left. The sheriff listened to all of it, documented what he could, prepared evidence of the trial, but he also knew that legal justice, even if it came, would never be enough. The boy would carry these scars forever, would struggle with trust and relationships and self-worth for the rest of his life, would have to rebuild an entire sense of what family and safety and love even meant. The sister was dead, her potential erased, her life reduced to a grave marker and a name in court documents. The father would likely hang or spend life in prison, but that wouldn't undo the years of suffering, wouldn't restore the childhoods he destroyed, wouldn't answer the fundamental question of how someone could look at their own children and see not human beings worthy of love, but objects to be controlled and broken. Justice in the legal sense was important, the sheriff knew, but it was also limited, unable to truly make whole what had been so thoroughly shattered. Still, it was what he could offer, the only tool he had, and he would use it with everything he had. Then came the night when everything nearly fell apart. Someone, some sympathizer or friend or fellow believer in the father's twisted philosophy, broke into the jail, tried to free him, claimed the sheriff had no right to hold a man for disciplining his own children. There was a struggle, shots fired, and for a few terrifying moments, it seemed like the father might actually escape, might disappear into the vast prairie and never face consequences, might even come back for the boy to finish what he'd started. But the sheriff was there, had been expecting something like this, had prepared for it, and he stopped the escape with cold efficiency. The sympathizer was arrested, The father returned to his cell, but the message was clear. There were people in this territory who sided with tyranny over justice, who would rather protect a child abuser than admit that their way of thinking about family and authority might be fundamentally broken. It was a reminder that evil rarely operates alone, that it builds networks, finds allies, creates cultures that sustain it across generations. The boy witnessed the escape attempt from the office window, saw the violence, heard the gunshots, and for a moment the fear returned full force. The certainty that his father would win, would always win, that running had been pointless and hope was just another word for future disappointment. But then he saw the sheriff stand firm, saw the father dragged back in chains, saw that there were limits to what even powerful men could get away with if someone with authority decided to enforce those limits. It was a lesson the boy needed, a counterweight to years of learning that adults couldn't be trusted and that the world was fundamentally unsafe. He started to believe, cautiously, carefully, that maybe not all men were like his father, that maybe protection was possible, that maybe the world contained both monsters and people who fought monsters, and that the difference between those two groups mattered more than anything else. The sheriff saw this shift in the boy, this fragile beginning of recovery, and knew that whatever happened at trial, whatever sentence the father received, this moment right here was a real victory, a child learning that he deserved to be safe. The night before they were set to leave for the county seat in the trial, the sheriff and the boys sat on the office porch, watching the sunset over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained so much ugliness. The boy asked if his father would hang, and the sheriff answered honestly that he probably would, that what he'd done was too severe, too documented, too impossible to explain away even in a system biased toward fathers and property owners. The boy nodded, said nothing for a while, then asked if it was wrong that he felt relieved, that he wanted his father dead, that the thought of the man being executed brought him peace instead of sadness. The sheriff thought carefully before answering, chose his words with the weight they deserved, told the boy that feeling relief at being saved from someone who hurt you wasn't wrong, it was human, and that sometimes the death of someone evil was something to be grateful for, not guilty about. They sat in silence after that, man and boy, sheriff and survivor, two people who'd seen the worst of what humans could do to each other and were trying, in their own ways, to figure out how to keep living in a world that contained such darkness. The trial lasted 3 days, though the outcome was never really in doubt once the evidence was presented, once the journals were read aloud in court, once the jury saw a photograph of the cellar and the chains and the grave. The father's lawyer tried every defense, claimed insanity, claimed frontier hardship, claimed that the sheriff had planted evidence and coached the boy and that this was all an elaborate conspiracy against a God-fearing man trying to raise his family according to his beliefs. But the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Murder, unlawful imprisonment, child abuse, and a list of charges so long it took the judge 5 minutes to read them all. The father showed no emotion when the verdict was read, no remorse, no understanding, just a blank stare that suggested he still couldn't comprehend how the world had turned against him for doing what he believed was right. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out in 30 days, and even that seemed too merciful for what he'd done, but was the maximum the law allowed, and it would have to be enough. The boy sat through the entire trial, the sheriff beside him, listening to every horrible detail of his own life discussed by strangers, hearing his sister's suffering documented in clinical legal language that somehow made it both more real and less comprehensible. He cried during parts of the testimony, sat frozen during others, and through it all the sheriff remained a steady presence, a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore, that telling the truth had consequences, and those consequences included people believing him, supporting him, making sure that justice happened. After the verdict, people came up to the boy, strangers mostly, and told him he was brave, that he'd done the right thing, that his testimony had helped ensure his father would never hurt anyone again. The boy didn't feel brave, felt mostly exhausted and hollow, but he nodded and accepted their words because he understood they needed to say them, needed to believe that the system had worked, that good had triumphed, that the story had a clear moral ending, Maybe it did, or maybe it was just at this time, for once, the truth had been too obvious to ignore. The sheriff arranged for the boy to stay with a family on the edge of town. Good people who'd lost a son to fever years back and had room in their home and their hearts for a child who needed both. It wasn't adoption, not yet, just fostering, giving the boy time to heal, to adjust, to figure out what he wanted his future to look like now that he actually had a future. The first few weeks were hard, the boy expecting punishment for small mistakes, flinching at Ray's voices, unable to understand kindness without looking for the hidden price. But the family was patient, had been warned by the sheriff what to expect, and slowly, incrementally, the boy started to believe that maybe this was real. Maybe he was allowed to be a child. Maybe laughing and playing and feeling safe weren't privileges that could be revoked at any moment. The sheriff visited regularly, checked in, made sure the transition was working, and watched with quiet satisfaction as the boy gradually became lighter, younger somehow, as if years of forced aging were reversing now that the weight of survival was lifted. The hanging took place on a cold morning in November. The father led to the gallows with the same blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial, still unrepentant, still convinced that history would eventually vindicate him. The sheriff attended, duty requiring his presence, and he watched as justice, imperfect and inadequate but necessary, was finally served. The father's last words were a rambling speech about biblical authority and the weakness of modern society. Words that convinced no one and changed nothing, just a final gasp of philosophy that had always been nothing more than evil dressed up in respectability. When the trap door opened and the rope went taut, the sheriff felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a weary recognition that one threat had been eliminated but thousands more remained, that the ideology that had shaped this man's cruelty was still out there, still being taught, still being passed down to new generations who would believe that power over others was the same as love. But at least this one monster was gone, and that was something, more than nothing, a small victory in an ongoing war. The boy didn't attend the execution, the sheriff having decided that witnessing his father's death would help nothing and harm much. Instead, the boy spent that morning at his new home, learning to do chores that were just chores and not punishments, eating breakfast that came with conversation instead of silence, existing in a space where mistakes meant gentle correction instead of violence. He knew what was happening that morning, had been told honestly what the sentence meant and when it would be carried out, and when the appointed hour came and went, he sat quietly for a moment, processing the reality that his father was gone, truly gone, forever. Then he went outside to help his foster father mend a fence. Simple work with clear purpose, and found comfort in the normalcy of it, in the idea that his life might now consist of ordinary moments instead of constant fear. That evening, the sheriff visited, and the boy asked if it was over, if he was safe now. And the sheriff told him yes, this particular danger had ended, though life would always contain risks and challenges and difficulties. But those were different from what he'd endured, the sheriff said. Those were the normal struggles of existence, not the manufactured torture of someone who twisted love into something unrecognizable. Years passed, as they always do, and the boy grew into a young man, scarred but not broken, damaged but not destroyed, carrying his past with him but not letting it define every moment of his present. He learned to trade, made friends, fell in love eventually, built a life that his younger self would have thought impossible. Sometimes the nightmares returned. Sometimes the memories would surface unexpectedly, triggered by a smell or a sound or just a random firing of traumatized neurons. And in those moments, he would remember the cellar, the chains, his sister's screams, his father's cold eyes. But he'd also learned, with help from the family who'd taken him in and the sheriff who'd saved him, that surviving trauma didn't mean forgetting it or pretending it hadn't happened. It meant integrating it into a larger story where darkness existed but didn't dominate, where pain was real but so was recovery. He visited his sister's grave regularly, talked to her, told her about his life, apologized for surviving when she hadn't, thanked her for protecting him when she could, and slowly made peace with the guilt that came from being the one who got away. The sheriff stayed in his position for another decade before retiring, his hair gone completely gray, his body worn down by years of confronting violence and injustice and the casual cruelty that seemed woven into the fabric of frontier life. He'd saved others over those years, children and women and vulnerable men, had stood between the powerful and the powerless more times than he could count, had built a reputation as someone who actually enforced the law rather than just enforcing hierarchy. He thought about that boy often, checked in on him regularly even after retiring, watched with pride as a child he'd saved became a man who helped others, who'd taken his suffering and transformed it into empathy rather than bitterness. In his final years, when people asked the old sheriff about his career, about the cases that mattered most, he always came back to that boy found stumbling into town one evening, terrified and broken, and somehow still brave enough to trust one more adult one more time. That case, the sheriff would say, reminded him why the work mattered, why someone had to be willing to stand up and say that no, not everything was acceptable, that fathers didn't own their children, that authority came with responsibility, not just privilege, and that justice, when it finally arrived, was worth every difficult moment it took to achieve. In the end, the Old West was saved not by the fastest guns or the strongest fists, but by the few who understood that real strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, that real courage meant standing alone when necessary, and that real justice meant believing the powerless even when the powerful insisted they were lying. The boy's story became legend in that region, told and retold with variations and embellishments, but always with the same core truth, that evil hides in plain sight, that looking away makes you complicit, and that sometimes salvation comes not from heaven, but from one person deciding that enough is enough and that the law, for once, would serve justice instead of power. And in those frontier towns where isolation still created islands of potential abuse, where patriarchal authorities still gave men dangerous control over their families, the story of the sheriff who'd stood up to a father's tyranny became a warning and a promise both, that monsters might thrive in darkness, but bring them into the light, and they could be defeated not easily but completely, and that every child, no matter how powerless they seemed, deserved someone willing to fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. If this story moved you, left a comment below sharing your thoughts about courage, justice, and protecting the vulnerable, because sometimes the stories that challenge us the most are the ones we need to hear.